Hello, my friends. My name is Matt Whitman. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we are working on a challenging genre of the Bible, that is prophecy. Narrative is so dang easy. You just read the story, and you're like, well, what does the story mean? Why is this even in the Bible? And it kind of works. Prophecy doesn't make as much sense looking forward as it does when you look backwards, and that's just the nature of the biblical genre. So we have been going slowly through Matthew chapter 24, and some of you are like, that's not why we're going slowly. We go so slowly through everything. What are you talking about? Yeah, you're right. You caught me. That is absolutely true. But even more so, we're going slowly through Matthew 24 so as to try to understand as much biblical context as we can here for what Jesus might mean by this phrase, the abomination that causes desolation, and what we're to make of this additional editorial note that says, let the reader understand. We're going to pick up right where we left off yesterday after my dear friend Jeffrey plays some music. But given what we just read from that historical book of 2 Maccabees, you can understand why a whole lot of people during Jesus' time would be like, that was it right there. That's what Daniel was talking about. The temple was profaned, probably in a lot of ways even worse, though it wasn't torn down stone from stone. It was more deliberately profaned by the Greeks than it was by the Babylonians. And what's worse about what the Greeks did is that they forced the Jews to participate in the profaning under threat of death for them or their loved ones or their offspring. It sounds like it was a horrible, murderous, torturous moment. And these are the intellectual descendants of Alexander the Great, by the way. And Alexander the Great gets that title, the Great, and in some ways it's deserved because he had this unifying vision for the world. And in the West, we kind of like Alexander the Great because there's some elements of democracy and stuff there. Whatever the case, Alexander is great in a military sense. He is great in terms of his effect on the world. He is great in terms of like a Times Person of the Year kind of way, where it's not really about like, are you good or not? It's like, did you affect a lot of things? And, well, who has ever affected more things than Alexander the Great, save Jesus of Nazareth? After Jesus, Alexander, I think, is the biggest deal in all of human history. But that doesn't mean that he was Alexander the Good. That's kind of a different thing. Alexander was more than willing to use all kinds of force to advance what I think we'd have to agree is a pretty jingoistic, culturally superior notion of how he thought that things ought to be. And in fairness, all the empires of the world at that time spoke that same language. It wasn't like there was anybody out there in some little tribe somewhere who kind of thought like modern day progressivism in terms of sort of like a Marxist oppressor-oppressed dichotomy or anything like that. Like, everybody thought in terms of, yeah, our local gods will empower us, and then we'll go and defeat our enemies on the battlefield, and then we'll triumph over them, and we'll make our thing, and that'll prove who was right all along, and our thing is the best. And Alexander was just the best at that game. But unlike the Persians, who thought it savvy to give people a little longer leash, especially in their earlier days under Cyrus and their founders, the Greeks quickly went to a much shorter leash, all the way to the point where we have historical documentation of Jews feeling so much cultural pressure and succumbing to the cultural pressure so much under the Greek-occupied version of Jerusalem that they invented some kind of like reverse circumcision surgery so that when they wrestled, which in the Greek style was, of course, butt naked, people wouldn't be like, it's circumcised, it's gross. They'd be like, that guy looks Greek enough. I mean, if you kind of squint and you're clear back here, I'd say that looks not circumcised. My point being, Alexander's legacy cut all the way down to the most intimate parts of who a person was and what they were allowed to think. And there's some pretty cool things about Alexander's legacy, and there's also some just ick, and especially when you look at it through the lenses of right now and this confusing moment in terms of how we think about culture and global culture and how we all get along. It's a pretty bizarre legacy. But in the ancient Near Eastern mind, the legacy was really simple. Nebuchadnezzar was uppity, and he thought that he was more powerful than God, and he mistook God correcting his own people through him for him being a more powerful God than God, and Nebuchadnezzar was judged. Belshazzar thought that his dad's conquest was a bigger deal than God. And the Old Testament narrative makes it clear that Belshazzar made the same exact mistake. He imagined that God using his father and him to correct his chosen people, the Jews, meant that they were more powerful than God, and they were not. And of course, Esther and King Xerxes and Haman, all of those same things come up there, also set against the backdrop of Persian culture. And then here again, in 2nd Maccabees, in the accounts of the things that happened in the 2nd century as the Greek overlords overexerted themselves against the Jews, it makes sense that the Jews would read that as part of the same exact historical narrative and theme about these uppity kings, imagining that since God used them to correct the Jewish people for them not obeying God, that they were somehow proving that they were more powerful than the Jewish God. And so that language I was reading there in that passage from 2nd Maccabees is reflective that the author, he still kind of gets it. No, this is the sovereign plan of God. This has been the deal all along, that these kind of corrections come and go. And anybody in the Old Testament narrative who imagines that God can be mocked or taunted by foreign kings who God moves around like chess pieces on a board is going to end up looking very, very silly themselves, because judgment is coming for them as well. God might have used that foreign king as an instrument of judgment or correction for his own people, but then he judges that foreign king for participating in that because it's a reflection of who they already were. If that raises questions for you about the character of God and justice and all of that, that's completely fair, and we can get into that another time. That, I think, puts us in the headspace, though, of how your regular reader would have encountered what Jesus was saying here in Matthew chapter 24 when we're talking about the abomination that causes desolation. They would have put themselves in Daniel's shoes and gone to Nebuchadnezzar looking backwards, Belshazzar in the moment, and then probably Antiochus Epiphanes and the Greeks as described in 2 Maccabees 6 in terms of what was the future fulfillment anticipated by the book of Daniel. But Jesus, by bringing this up as a sign that is still coming, seems to indicate that that common assumption was incorrect, and that the true abomination that causes desolation that Daniel was pointing to in chapter 9 had not yet been realized at the time that Jesus says these words in Matthew 24:15, and that's what we're going to try to unpack tomorrow. Thanks for hanging out with me. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour Podcast. Let's do this again soon.